Good evening. This is the English Language Revision Unit for Carlam Cymru. Noswaith dda pawb. We're going to look at a Unit 2 paper this evening, and we're going to look at the lifeboat section. This is the paper from summer 2022. So if you want to download that paper, it should be in the folder ready for you to download as well. My name is Miss Hales, and I will be presenting this session today. Please feel free to use any of the Q&A sections when we meet as a live in a couple of sessions time. So you can come to the live and you can ask us questions there if you have any questions. So make note of what you want to ask and come to that session. This is about 45 minutes, but it has been recorded, and so you will be able to access it and look back over it. I'm going to take you through the reading section of a Unit 2 paper today. So hopefully by the end of this lesson, you will be familiar with the types of reading questions on a Unit 2 paper, and you'll understand how to find the answers for the questions and how to actually answer them, so how to structure your response. So this is the front of the paper that we're looking at today. You'll notice it says that it's a Unit 2 paper and that you'll have editing and proofreading to do. So this is the paper where you've got the editing and proofreading section after the reading. What you'll find is that the focus for today is just on the reading. Next week we'll do the writing. Section A is worth 40 marks, as is Section B. So you need to make sure that you are spending an equal amount of time on both sections. So it's about an hour on each section. So today we're going to look at just the reading. In the exam, make sure you've got plenty of black pens, and this is the paper where you might want some highlighters to help you underline and highlight the points that you want to make. And obviously look really carefully at the marks. I'm sure your teachers told you this. The marks are going to show you how much you need to write. So when it's a 1-mark question, it's a short answer. When it's a 10-mark question, you need to write a lot. So look really carefully. You've got 40 marks available on this section. So obviously some basic points to remember. Read the instructions on the front cover. Recap what you need to be doing. Make sure you use black pen. The examiner will be looking at your paper online, so they don't have a physical copy of your paper, so being able to see it clearly is going to be a bonus. So black pen only. Make sure you fill in all the relevant detail, including the question numbers, especially if you answer them out of order. Make sure you put your question numbers in the margin. Make sure that you do complete every section, including that proofreading and editing, which is just after the reading section. And you're going to have one written task, which we're going to look at next week. So in this session, we're going to look at a number of texts on the same theme. And what we're going to look at today is the lifeboat paper. So all our texts are on the theme of lifeboats. And we have 5 papers, 5 texts to look at, and they're labelled A to E. Read each text carefully and you answer the questions that relate to them. You need to make sure you always check which text the question is related to. So for example, don't answer any questions which say text B if you've been reading text A. So make sure that you've linked them together. And obviously, as I've just said, look at the marks available. Make sure you write enough points. So just a quick recap, organising your time in that exam. It's a 2-hour paper. Nobody's going to tell you when to move on. You have got to monitor your own time. A and B worth the same amount of marks, spend the same amount of time on them. You're going to have 2 things to do in section A, the reading, which should take you most of the time, and then that editing that you do at the end. Okay, so these are some of the key questions. So what I would do now is I would pause. I would maybe print this slide off or have a think about this slide and make sure that I understood the key words that are going to show up on this paper in the reading section. So these are all the types of words that the examiner could use to ask you your questions. What I would be checking, do you understand the word in the first instance? Second of all, do you know what the exam requires from you? So is it a long answer question if it says find? Is it a short answer question if it says summarise? What is it needing to do? And then under the skills, what do you need to do to find the answer? Are you going to be skimming and scanning? Are you going to be reading in detail? Are you going to be using P? What are you going to do to answer that question? So again, here are the keywords for a reading exam. And what I would say to you with these ones, have a think. Can you classify these into low tariff, and high tariff questions. Can you split these up and work out which ones are going to be the low mark questions, the 1 mark, the 2 mark questions, and which ones are going to be the 5, 8, 10 mark questions? Can you work out which one's which, and therefore do you know what is required of you in the exam? So I would say low tariff are the ones which give you the keywords such as find, retrieve, list, the ones which offer you a multiple choice. Those are the questions which are not requiring you to do a lot of explanation, you're not analysing, you're simply finding information and writing it down quickly. Those are low tariff questions. For the high tariff questions, you're being asked to analyse. You're being asked to think about how does the writer persuade or convince. You're being asked to synthesise or compare. You're being asked to do more, and therefore they gave you more marks for it. All right, so low tariff, high tariff questions. It's good to know which one's which, because then you know which ones you can spend the least amount of time on, which ones you can, do quickly and move on. So here we go. These are the types of questions that we're going to go through this afternoon. We're going to look at the access, location and retrieve, which are the multiple choices, the find and copy questions, okay? So first of all, I understand how I do this. And obviously you might be okay with it, but you might want practice, which is why you're here tonight. Or sometimes you might not understand it at all, but hopefully by the end of this session you will. So again, I've given you these to have a think about and to pause, consider and to answer whether you can do these or not, okay? So do you know what they need you to do? Are you able to do it? Okay, and then finally on this quick overview are the skills that will be needed in a reading exam. I've already mentioned skimming and scanning. That's something you should be relatively familiar with. Doing it all the way through school so far, you read over very quickly, you're looking for specific information, you're trying to locate a number or a fact or a date or a name. It's a quick answer. With the inference, you're thinking about the suggested meanings. You're looking between the lines. You're trying to read in more detail. You're trying to think about it a bit more. Comparison, this is when you need to use all those comparison connectives that your teacher's been talking about. Retrieval, just bring back the information. Verbal reasoning are the ones which ask you about the meaning of a word and which are asking you to work it out in your head, to think it through. So verbal reasoning is when you're trying to talk through what a word means and using your common sense, basically. Then you've got deduction, where you're being asked to take information, add it together to make up something. Summarize, when you're being asked to shorten down a much longer text. In some of the exams, you're being asked to interpret the meaning. You're trying to work it out. And this is when you use your verbal reasoning to interpret. You're being asked to select quotes. When you get a how does the writer question or what impression do you get, you're being asked to look at the words of the text. So you're asked to use quotes. Then obviously you've also often got explain as a keyword and analyze. Explaining, putting it into your own words, explaining what you understand by it. And analyze is when you're thinking about the effect it has and why the writers used it. So they're really, really important skills for a reading exam. And this is where you need to stop and pause and think, make sure you're confident with those terms. If you're not, go back and look over them, try and work out what they are, and try and make sure that you can identify when you're being asked to do which one. So, as I've already mentioned, we're going to be looking at lifeboats this evening. This is the information that you would get on the paper telling you what to look at and what to do. All right. Please note as well that there are often extra pages in the back of your answer booklet. And if you fill your answer booklet, including all the extra pages, just ask for another booklet. So, tonight we're going to look at 5. You could have as many as 7 texts to read. If you do get a lot of texts, some of them will be infographics, so words and pictures. You might get pie charts, you might get graphs. You're going to get information in a lot of different forms, so you need to be confident that you can read anything that's put in front of you. You will always have them linked on a theme, and handy, the writing section will also relate to that theme as well. So you will be asked to write something which is related to what you've read about in order for you to gather information, do a little bit of research. you need to make sure you're answering the right text. So make sure that the answer that you're given has come from the text that was identified. So when it says text A, your answers have all come from text A. When it says text B, your answers have all come from text B. And again, just to remind you, make sure you write enough points for the marks. Okay, so here is our first text. If you're looking at your paper, if you have your paper in front of you, you'll notice that it's a much longer text, but it's from a fact sheet and it's written by the RNLI. So the information that you're given in the exam tells you who provided it and who it is for, so who it is aimed at and what the purpose is. All right, so this fact sheet was written by the RNLI. So straight away, we know that it comes from a reputable source. We know that it's there to provide information. So it's not trying to convince, it's not trying to persuade, it's providing info. And it also says who that info is for. So it gives you the audience. It's for people who are already part of the RNLI. So it's staff and volunteers who work for the RNLI. Our first question is a what question. It's a very simple 1-mark question, which is asking you to find one thing. And the key word that it's asking you to look for is vision. So you skim for vision. So can you take a moment now? Can you skim your paper? Can you find what the vision of the RNLI is? Can you write it down on your answer booklet? So the examiner is asking you to use your deduction skills to retrieve information. It's a find and copy. And there is only 1 mark available, and that 1 mark would be given to you if you've written down that the vision of the RNLI is to end preventable loss of life at sea. You can see the examiner hasn't put it in a full answer. They've literally just written down the phrase to end preventable loss of life at sea. You would be given the mark if you put it in a full sentence. You wouldn't lose marks if you didn't put it in a full sentence. Okay, so this is one of the ones where you can literally just write that phrase down. So hopefully you can get it right. It needs to be exact in order to get the mark. It is just a retrieval, find and copy. Okay, so here is the longer section of text A. And this time the question says, which of the following is not true? Tick that box. So this is slightly more complicated. It gives you 5 statements, 4 of which are true, 1 of which is not true. So you have to check that text, find the 4 that are true, eliminate them, and then tick the box of the one that's left. So you tick the box of the one that is not true. So again, it's skim and scan and it's elimination. You know that this is going to come from the text, so you can ignore the pie chart on the other side because that's just about the money, and these are not about the money. So you can ignore that. And so you only get 1 mark, and the 1 mark is for the statement, the RNLI is part of the Coast Guard. And if you have a look, it actually says in there that the RNLI is separate from the Coast Guard and independent from the government. Right, so it's not part of the Coast Guard. So it's not true. So you tick that box. Okay. So again, text A, and this time we're being asked about the money. What did it dedicate 53% of the charitable spend to in 2018? So we know now that we need to look at the pie chart. We haven't looked at that yet, so now we know we've got to look at the pie chart. And we also know that we've got to look at the one labelled spend because it's asking about the spending of the RNLI. We also have a key figure, 53%. So we've got to look for 53%. And when we found all of that, we will discover that it is for lifeboats, property and equipment. So 53% of the money went on lifeboats, property and equipment. And again, you would need to have that exact in order to get the mark. Okay, so question 4. What does the text say which shows the RNLI still has important work to do? It's a 3-mark question. Therefore, you need to find 3 things. Really straightforward. So this time you're being asked to interpret meaning, ideas and info and to refer to evidence. You're going to need to find some quotes. So first, it's the first 3-mark question we've got. Find 3 points. Skim for the word still. All right, so you're looking for what does the RNI still need to do. So you're looking for still, but so you're also going to be using your common sense as you go through this. So you've got a couple of things that I've highlighted for you, showing you the kind of area that you need to be looking at. The examiner will give you 4 or 5 the examiner will be given 4 or 5 options to give you marks from. So there are different things that you can say. And what you will find with this type of question is that they will reward valid alternatives. So if you find something that they don't have written down and it is valid, they will give you the mark for it. But on the whole, they're looking for 4 things: that there's still significant loss of life in the UK, that people still lose their lives, that massive numbers of people drown each year, that work on prevention should be ongoing, and that spending exceeds their income, that there's still work to be done regarding fundraising. So any of those 3 would get you 3 marks. Okay. All right, so now we move on to text B. So text B is a poster. It's advertising an open day at the lifeboat station. So the first thing it asks you is, what does the text mean when it refers to a rare chance to get aboard Tenby's lifeboat? And it's 1 mark. So really, the word they're focusing you on is interpreting the meaning of the word rare. What does rare mean? Can you define it? Common sense is going to help you with this one. First thing you need to do is you need to check that word in the sentence. You need to go back and read it in context. Make sure you're really confident that you know what it means, and then put it down in your own words. So the examiner is going to give you 1 mark if you've explained that the chance to go on to Tenby's lifeboat doesn't happen very often or is unusual. And there you see that phrase, reward valid alternatives. Okay. Right, so we're still on text B. List 2 things it's possible to do between 10 and 4:30. 2 things, 2 marks. Make sure you list just 2 of them. Don't copy all of them, because if you copy them all, they will not give you the marks. Even if you've included the things that are right, if you've copied everything down, they're not going to award you the marks. So make sure you limit it down. Just put 2 things down. It's testing your ability to retrieve information. And it's telling you, right, 1 thing you can do is you can go into the station. So free admission to the station. Then the next one lists quite a few things. You've got a chance to go on board the lifeboat. You can meet crew members. You can learn about technology. And you can also go to the shop to buy things. There's quite a lot of things there. Don't just copy it word for word. Bullet point them, separate them off, and choose the right number. So again, 1 mark for any of the following up to a total of 2. And it gives you all those things that you could mention. Okay. All right, we're still on text B. And this time we've got a single mark question, 1 mark question. What is meant by the phrase vantage point? So this is one of those questions where it's looking for something very specific. It wants you to explain it. So again, check that word in context. Read the text again to find out where it is, to make sure that it makes sense to you. If you don't know what it means, make an educated guess. It's testing your ability to use verbal reasoning. So this is where you've got to use your common sense and try and talk through the answer. But it's helping you. It's saying, right, come on then, is it one of these? And it gives you 4 options. Usually you can eliminate 2 of them before you even start. You know, it's just so obvious that they're wrong, you can eliminate them. And then you're left with 2 that are maybe a little bit more difficult to work out. But with this one, it's pretty easy to work it out. It says you can witness close up from the viewing gallery inside the station or from the vantage point of Castle Hill. Now, don't get thrown by the fact that it mentions castle. This isn't the name for a part of a castle. It's not a photograph gallery. It's not an act of courage. Therefore, the only answer is the one that says a position that gives a good view. Okay, we're moving on. We're on text C now, and we won't have spent much time on A1 to 5 so far. We'll have moved quite quickly through these because these are single mark, 2 mark questions. They're not taking a long time. So we're going quite quickly through the reading texts. The biggest amount of time you'll have spent so far probably is on reading the texts in the first place. Okay, so we're on A8. It says, write down 1 way in which members of the public have reacted to criticism of the RNLI. So we've got to skim and scan for criticism to see what the consequences were. However, criticism shows up quite a few times in this text. So the thing to do now is find out where it's got criticism linked to public, and then you're going to start seeing those consequences. So make sure that you're really focusing in on the right part of the text. And we're using deduction skills. We're trying to retrieve information using our deduction skills. And so you're going to get two choices, two things that you could have said. You only need to say one because you're only going to get 1 mark for this. So they're looking for you to say they either cancel their donations or they pledge to increase their support. Because if you read, you'll say that there was a mixed response to the criticism. Some said they were going to cancel, some said that they would increase their support. So you have those two options and you write down one of those options. Excuse me, sorry. Okay, so we're still on text C. A9. Explain why some MPs were concerned about the RNLI's international work. Skim and scan for MPs. We've got to see what they thought about it. What did they fear? Find where MPs are and then see what the concerns were. You need to explain it so it's more than just copying. Make sure you cover those 2 points. And we're looking at interpreting meaning. We're making sure that we're getting the information and that we are referring to evidence. This is more challenging. It's a more complex text, but it's still straightforward in its answer. You're just going to put 2 things down. So award 1 mark for each of the following. They didn't think the British public would be aware that they were donating, so they thought that the British public were being misled. That's 1 mark. And the second mark, that the project should be supported from the government rather than RNLI. All right, so there's 2 things that are being mentioned as fears from the MPs. Okay, so we're moving on. We're on to text D. So we need to look at this article from a national newspaper. A10 asks us, what does the text mean when it describes the charity's website as having a month's worth of traffic in a few days? It's only a 1 marker, so you just need to try and put that into your own words and explain it. So again, find that phrase in context. Always check it out. Read back over and make sure you know what it means. And that's where it turns up. It says the charity's website has had a month's worth of traffic in a few days. Use your own words, explain what it means. You're being asked to interpret meaning, so you're being asked to think it through and give your interpretation of it. And you would get 1 mark if you said that the website had been accessed or viewed many times in a few days, and as many times in a few days as it would normally be in a month. So you could also just say it was busier than usual. So it's a really straightforward interpretation response. Not a difficult one, not looking for you to analyse. It just needs a quick explanation. Okay, this is our first complex answer. This is the first one that needs us to write in detail. So you'll find you've got a big space in the answer booklet. So this is one of the ones that I'm going to ask you to pause and have a go at once we've gone through how to do it. So it's asking you to synthesize. This is one of the key words from that reading skills section that we did at the beginning. What does synthesize actually mean? So we're going to look at that and we're going to think about how we're going to get those 10 things that we need to talk about. So synthesis is really important. Please check before you start which texts it's asking you to do. So this says text C and D. You've read them both. You just need to make sure that you reread them now to focus on the international work of the RNLI. So what is synthesis? Well, the subject officer at the WJC says that it's not a summary. So it's not a shortened version of the text in your own words. That's not what you're doing. The subject officer says that synthesis is a collation of points, some of which are direct quotes, on a particular topic or focus across a range of texts. A candidate is able to reference which text their point comes from in a synthesis response. So this is where you need to be able to say, text C says this about international work. Text D says this about international work. Text C says, list a few things what text C says. Text D says, list a few things that text D says. You don't need to compare. You don't need to use the comparison connectives. So this is one way of synthesizing. Your teacher may have told you a different way. You stick to what you're confident with, what you're comfortable with. So what I teach my pupils to do, I ask them first of all to identify the main points in each text and to highlight the keywords. So with this particular question, read through, what does text C and D say about international work of the RNLI? So you're looking for anything about the international work, you're highlighting it. Are there any connections that can be made between the texts? Do they talk positively about it? Do they talk negatively about it? Can you use that as your overview that you're going to start with? So could you say something like text C and text D both mention the international work of the RNLI and say that, is there something they've got in common? Clearly identify which text you're referring to. So all the way through, if you take a quote, text C says that, text D says that. So you're clearly identifying it. That way you're going to get your mark. Make sure that if you're saying something, you're backing it up with evidence. You're using quotes, you're using words from the text to show why you think that. Always keep going back to that question. So the question was about international work. Use addition connectives, such as and. You don't need the comparison connectives like similarly or on the other hand. You don't need those. Make sure you look at both texts. Make sure you cover a relatively equal amount of marks. So if it's a 10-mark question, ideally you want 5 from text C and 5 from text D. Sometimes you might find that you've got 6 from C and 4 from D, and that's okay. But you don't want to try and overbalance it. You want to try and make sure that you balance those marks. And then obviously you need to make sure that you give enough points for the marks available. So making sure that you give lots of new points for each mark that you want to gain. So here is your chance to have a go. Look at C and look at D. What do they say about the international work? Pause the screen here now. Have a go at this question. These are some of the answers that the examiner is looking for. So here are some of the things that you could get marks for. There may be others, and again, this is one of those questions which will say reward valid alternatives. So you may find that you've got something which isn't on here, but if it's a valid alternative, you might get the mark for it. But these are the ones that were put down on the mark scheme that the examiner is looking for. So next is question, well, how do I write that answer then? So here is an example of a good one. In text C, there's a negative attitude towards the international work. It starts by saying that the 3 newspapers had criticised the RNLI about their work overseas. It mentions that an MP thought the projects were more suitable for support from the government than the RNLI. It also mentions how the criticism about the international work created a mixed response, which caused some members to cancel their donations whilst others pledged their support. I've done text C. I've managed to identify text C. I've used short quotes, and I've made sure I've focused on that question by bringing back the international work in my response. I then wrote about text D, and I finished with an overview of both texts, which is a useful way of doing it. It's a useful way of summing it up. So in that answer, there are 10 things mentioned, 5 from C, 5 from D. There are quotes that are used to back up the points, and there is an overview of both texts. So it's a generally solid answer. Okay, so let's move on. So now we're on to text E. So we're working our way through the paper. We've done 4 of the 5 texts that we need to answer now, and we're on to text E. So we're on to question 12, and it's a 1-mark question again. What does the writer imply with the phrase creating a huge breaking wave in the first paragraph? So you're looking for impressions, you're looking for inference skills here. So verbal reasoning to infer what is meant by that phrase. So skim and scan to find the phrase. And you should find it just towards the end of that paragraph, cresting a huge breaking wave. You need to work out what it means, but once again, the examiner's helped you. The examiner's given you some options. So working it through, thinking about it, it's not being pushed into a huge wave. It's not being moved beneath it. It's not being pulled along by it. So therefore, it must mean moving at the top of a huge wave, cresting on the crest of a wave, right at the top of it. Okay, so we've got 1 mark there. We're going on to another question, which is also on text E. What impression does the writer create? So this is our impressions question. We're being asked to refer to evidence. We've got to use quotes, and we're using inference and deduction. We're using P in this one, and I'm sure your teacher's probably talked to you about P already. P is point, evidence, explanation. So you make a point about the impression that you're given of the lifeboat crew. You find a quote which creates that impression. You then explain how that quote shows that. It doesn't need to be a massive long explanation, but you need to be justifying your choice of that quote. You need to mention techniques if you can. So if there are techniques in the piece as you're reading it, mention them. If there aren't techniques, don't try and mention something and say there's not there. You know, we're not looking for you to just technique spot, but you're meant to be talking about the effect of those techniques, explaining what effect that creates. And here is the exam criteria. This is what the examiner is giving you marks for. So there are 10 marks available. And if you look at the bits that I have put in bold, they give you a sense of the key skill that you need to be using. So can you see in the first one, it says basic textual reference. Right, so for 2 or 3 marks, you're given basic or straightforward textual references. If you're going up to the 9 or 10 marks, can you see that it says that you're given well-selected examples and purposeful textual references? So for 9 or 10 marks, you're using some really good quotes. You're giving some really good justification for your points. Okay. So you need to cover a lot of points. For 10 marks, it says a wide range of impressions. So you're going to need to cover that detail in quite a lot of different points. So you're trying to make different points every time. So general tips, what do you need to do? You need to check how many points it's worth. If it's 10 marks, you need 10 things to say. Again, highlight the keywords in the question. This time the focus is on the lifeboat crew and what impression you have of them. So do you think they're brave? Do you think they're well trained, for example? You're going to go through the text, you're going to highlight anything that helps to give you an impression of the lifeboat crew. And then you're going to link those together to talk about your impression of the lifeboat crew. You're going to use connectives to start every point. So firstly, secondly, next, then. Yeah, so you're going to use those connectives to start your points. And you're going to make sure you're using P. So you support every point with a quote and you explain the effect of that quote. Here are some of the answers. So if I were you, I would pause it on slide 30 and I would now have a go at doing this question. Then you get your answers. Those are the sorts of things the examiner is looking for you to mention. What sort of impression do you get? Generally, that the lifeboat crew are dedicated, they're heroic, they're brave, but they're just normal, everyday people. So here is the text, and here are some of the things that you could talk about. So the speed and how fast they seem to be going, the fact that they seem to be edging through, which suggests it's tricky. You could link that to the careful training to show that they're skillful. You get the idea that they're cresting the huge breaking wave, so it's perilous out there on the sea. You've got the idea that Dickerson doesn't want the presenter there, but he's mindful of the role he had to play. So he cares about what he's doing. He wants to give a good impression. The word danger is mentioned several times in this story. So you might want to talk about the fact that they seem to be very aware of the danger, but that the presenter seems to be insensitive to that danger. So that's another one you could do. And then the second part of the story, because I couldn't fit it all onto one slide, sorts of things you could talk about. Helen Carter had just watched every man she loved going out on the boat. So these are normal people with wives and children who are left behind when they go out. So they're risking things. You know, they care about their lifeboat role so much that they will leave behind the people they love. So it makes them sound really brave. They're making sacrifices to do this. And then the person who is talking talks about the fear of the lifeboat crew and says, you know, yes, they are frightened when they go out, so that they're normal, but they are brave because they overlook that fear and they go anyway. And then they talk about the vision that to these men, life is important. The life is to be cherished. So it makes them value their lives, and the lifeboat men, the lifeboat crew, value the lives that they've got of themselves and of others. Okay, so you're going to have to use point evidence explanation. So here's another example of a good one. Starting with my point, the writer makes the men sound brave and well trained. So my point about them, Then I need to give my evidence. So I've used the word edged and I've used the word careful training. Then I've given my explanation. So the highlighted green bit is the explanation, the reason why I chose those. Then I've used the second point, which is a technique this time. The writer uses a lot of emotional language. There was a repeated mention of danger and the woman who had watched every man she loved go out on the boat. And then what effect does that have? Makes them sound like they're courageous and they don't deserve to have it questioned by the presenter. Okay, so you'd do that then 10 times. So you'd have 10 of those point, evidence and explanations linked together if necessary, or just 10 separate points. It doesn't really matter as long as you've got 10 detailed explanations linked to quotes. Okay, so that would be the end of the reading section. So you'd then go into the editing section. And the editing section is where you're going to pick up a maximum of 5 marks for looking at the meaning of language, looking at the structure of a piece of writing and choosing words which fit the gaps. So the first question, it says, read the paragraph below, answer the questions. So it says, Mark looked, gives you a space, the horizon was growing unease. The storm was definitely getting closer, a gap. He knew that her boat had not yet returned. So I've got to circle a word that fits in gap 1 from the choice of words in A. Then I've got to circle a word that fits in gap 2 from the choice of words in B. So always have a go at this. Never leave this blank because it can make the difference. It really can. And if you're really unsure, have a guess. It's worth it because you've only got 4 options. You might have a chance of getting the answer. But what you're going to do is you're going to read through and you're going to try and fit the word in. So Mark looked in the horizon. Well, clearly that doesn't make sense. Mark looked around the horizon. That could make sense. Mark looked towards the horizon. That suggests it might be the right answer. Mark looked before the horizon. Right, that definitely doesn't make sense. So I'm left with 2 possibles. But because of the idea of growing unease suggests that you're looking towards something, that you're becoming more uneasy. You're not looking around it, you're looking towards it. So probably that's going to be the best answer. And then the second gap, the storm was definitely getting closer, but he knew her boat hadn't yet returned. Between, her boat had not returned. Instead, her boat had not returned. Likewise, her boat had not returned. There's only one answer this time that's going to fit, and that's but. So eliminate the options which don't make sense. Read it out loud. Well, no, don't read it out loud in the exam. Read it in your head. Put the words in. See what makes sense. Okay, and then we've got a second question, which says tick the pair of words. So this time, both words have got to fit into the gaps. The waves took them by surprise, but they dried it off and decided to head back to shore just as another wave wet towards them. That doesn't make sense. The wave took them by surprise, but they shrugged it off. That makes sense. Decided to walk back to shore just as another wave walked toward them. Waves don't walk. The wave took them by surprise, but they bounced it off. Bounce off a wave? I don't think so. Decided to head back to shore just as another wave crashed toward them. Crashed works, but bounced doesn't. The wave took them by surprise, but they laughed it off. Yeah, that makes sense. Decided to head back to shore just as another wave rolled toward them. That makes sense. So I think the pair of words we need is laughed and rolled. So it's the pair that needs to fit, and you tick the box for the pair that fits in. Okay. And then the last question in the editing section is the one where you've got to put the sentences into the right order. So you've got a story or part of a story, and you've got to make sure that you put the sentences in the right order and then decide which one would come first or fifth or whatever it is that they ask you to do. So in this particular question, they've given you some lines from a story about a lifeboat and a rescue. And again, definitely guess. Don't just leave this blank. Make sure you give it a go. Put them in the right order first. So you read it through. She was able to confirm, right, now that's the end of the story, isn't it? Speaking from a hospital bed. Okay, who and how did she end up in hospital? So that's not the start of a story. Late to her family. That's not the start of a story. A yachtswoman has been rescued. Now that sounds like the start of a story. So a yachtswoman has been rescued after spending 24 hours in the ocean. Right, that sounds like the start. The 32-year-old woman was picked up by a Coast Guard helicopter 17 miles off the Atlantic coast. That sounds good. Speaking from her hospital bed, Jenny Watson said she was grateful to be alive. Okay, making sense so far. She was able to confirm that she'd got into difficulties after her boat capsized. Yeah, still making sense. Later, her family issued a statement. Well, that sounds like it goes in the right order. So I've used my understanding of text, I've used my understanding of connectives to try and work out what order that story should go in. And I've put it into the right order. I've labelled them at the side, maybe put down A, B, C, D, E at the side of them, so I know what order is the right order. And then I've got to say which came first and which came fifth. So I know that it was sentence number 4 that came first, and it was sentence number 3 which came last. So I put down 4 and 3, and I get 1 mark for each of those. And that is the end of the paper. So, are you now familiar with the types of reading questions? Well, hopefully you are. And if you remember those slides at the beginning, they give you the types of questions and the skills that you need. And we've also now gone through what structure do you need to do to answer those questions. So hopefully you're a little bit more confident about our Unit 2 reading section. So thank you very much for coming to this evening's revision session. And this doesn't want to finish off for some reason. There we are. Thank you for attending. I hope you found it useful. Obviously, it has been recorded. Next week, we're going to look at the Unit 2 writing, so the description, the narration, the exposition. So the last bit of this paper, the section B. Hopefully, I'll see you then. And if you've got any questions, if you write them down, if you come to the live session in a couple of weeks' time, we'll be able to talk through them and answer those questions. If you'd like to give any feedback to Carol Cymru, they'd like to hear your views, and you've got a form there. So thank you very much. Hope you found this useful.